But anyway, yeah, so we wanted to have this fireside chat kind of about thinning decision making within an economic context. There was an article in our newsletter that set the tone. I'll recap some of the stuff we wrote about this month, talk through some of those decisions, and then open it up for everyone else. But I guess first, just a little bit about myself. I'm a forester at NNRG. I grew up in Southwest Washington and didn't immediately those surrounded by the mills and forests down there didn't immediately join the forestry team. I had a previous career in natural resource economics and kind of geospatial informatics, and eventually found my way back into forestry, where I am finishing a master's degree at the University of Washington on forest planning and forest economics. So I have been thinking about some of these questions, and I'd love to share some of these ideas with you. Um, Let me share the screen. I've got a few slides, and then we can just move into chatting. Um, is that up, Lauren?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. So thinning today to create value tomorrow, um, which was the topic of our newsletter this month. Oh, how do I go forward? There we go. So yeah, so we'll just cover a few topics that we touched on in that newsletter, how we frame the thinning decision, some aspects of thinning economics, and then leave you with some advice, some rules of thumb. And then I'd really like to make time to questions people have about this topic, information they want to share with us in the chat. Um, so thinning decisions. This is like a question that many people that have a forest ask themselves. Should I be thinning? And NRG, we often tell you yes. Especially if your forest is overstocked, it's facing mortality, growth is slowing, which is a frequent case among a lot of forest owners who have inherited kind of younger forests that were previously plantations. So often we're talking um, with our clients and with other people in the forest industry about thinning. Um, and we've talked about it for many years, before I even came to NRG, looking back through the blog archives, it's definitely, been discussed time and time again, but typically from a perspective of what is like the biological reasons for thinning and how do you decide when to thin based on biological markers, which are at the core of forestry and forest and thinning decision making, but are not the only perspective. And so we often talk about economics. And if someone were to have an objective that included making some revenue off their forest, like I know many of our clients do, it's not always the primary objective. But if you are interested in improving your revenues from thinning, then there are some decisions to consider. And the kind of thinning decisions right off the top can be broken down into what I call the thinning timing, which is when to thin, thinning intensity, how much to thin, and then your management regime, how many times to thin. And all of this adds up to ultimately a lot of decisions. For a forest that's 30 years old and you plan to thin it 3 or 4 times before maybe you leave it in a late sterile condition, each of the decisions of timing and intensity are conditional on the next decision about when to thin and how much to thin, and conditional on the next one. And all these decisions really add up together. So it becomes really hard to kind of understand what you should be doing in order to improve your revenues over that time period. Uh, so I thought we could just start with like a brief overview of forest productivity, which I imagine many people understand either directly or indirectly walking through your forest. You've seen stuff like this. Um, but I just put up this graph here on the right, especially the top right corner, just to emphasize this idea that forest growth is limited by carrying capacity. On any given chunk of land, only so many trees can grow there. And eventually, the forest gets so dense that trees are out competing each other for resources, and some trees will, well, most trees, all trees will slow down in growth, and some trees will succumb to mortality. Um, and so thinning is a mechanism of reducing this density and increasing growth. Um, and I wanted to point out something on this graph that really kind of should guide our thinking around decision making. Lauren, can you see my cursor? Is that possible on here? Okay. Um, which is this idea that as a forest is young, it's just putting a lot of time into root development, it's building its foliage, it's ramping up in growth. And the foliage is the energy, it's the solar panels, it's the energy producing factory of the tree and the forest. And as it invests energy in making this machinery, it can then get more energy from the sun and grow faster. And eventually this rate of growth really starts to accelerate. And we have this fast-paced growth of the forest into its kind of middle years. Um, but eventually the canopies close, the trees start to compete for sunlight, and growth is starting to get reduced because there isn't enough sunlight for all these trees. And so we start to slow down in growth as we go up here. And what's important to remember that on this graph, this is really just about forest as a whole. Individually, most trees have very few age-related declines. They can continue to grow more in every year of life than they did in the previous, as long as they have good resources to grow. There are some caveats there with some species, like our local red alder, that are more prone to age related declines. But over the course of the whole forest, there's only so many trees that can fit in there. And thinning allows us to come back from the reduced growth curve back to this really steep area where we get more increases in growth. And this is effectively just that the core idea of thinning is that we are trying to bring the forest back into a high growth capacity area. That can be for many objectives, such as growing bigger trees to make into wildlife trees, growing bigger trees to sell later. But ultimately, we're trying to manage density in order to get a different growth rate. So with that kind of setup, I wanted to ask this question to everyone. Here's a picture of a 100-year-old tree. You can see the rings on it. You can see around the year 70, a thinning occurred. And just, was this a good thinning decision? You know, just want people to sit there, think about it for a second. How could we tell? Looking back, this tree was cut clearly to make this image, but in the year 70, when this tree was 70 years old, 30 years ago, someone chose to thin this forest. And growth really accelerated after that. You can see the size of the rings and the amount of space covered in the 30-year window here versus the 70-year window before that. But was that a good thinning decision? And I'll let everyone ruminate on that, but I mean, clearly, there's not a great answer to this because good thinning decisions are about meeting your objectives in your forest, right? But if you could outline your objectives really clearly, then you might get closer to asking, is this thinning outcome the one you wanted? And when we talk about improving thinning revenues, we're really asking this question of, is this a value producing thinning decision? And we try to ask ourselves, is the combined value produced now and in the future outweighing the cost of action and the opportunity cost of waiting? And this is typically thought of in an economic context, but you can also imagine value being something non-economic. In either case, you are waiting perhaps to get that value, and you're taking action now to stimulate growth to get there later. I put this up because one of my pet peeves is that everyone loves these type of pictures. That looks like that tree just took right off. But we really don't know if this was actually a good decision or not. We need more information. We need to know what the stocking density was, what their objectives were, and if you're trying to improve revenues, what the different costs and prices that were available at the time when this decision was made. So just because a tree shows exceptional growth doesn't always mean it was a good thinning decision. And a lot of this is about trading off the value today versus the value tomorrow. If we thin a forest sooner, we get our revenue and our costs sooner. If we thin later, we have to wait for that revenue. But those costs are also pushed to the future, so we don't have to incur them right now. If we thin sooner, we're going to remove some of the trees in the forest, which means that those trees can't continue to grow for us and produce larger diameter and more wood products
Hmm.
in the future. And if we thin later, that gives more time for those same trees to grow. Um, if we thin sooner, we get improved growth of the residual trees. And if we thin later, that growth may slow and even lead to mortality if the forest gets too overstocked. And then if we thin sooner, we may lead to larger diameter trees. And if we thin later, maybe smaller diameter trees, but that's going to be a little contingent on your site conditions and a few other factors. But this is kind of the trade-off we're sitting with, and we're trying to decide, is it time to thin? A lot of times we can decide it's biologically time to thin, but it may not be operationally time to thin, and it may not be the most cost-effective time to thin. And so you're trying to ask that question if waiting or the accumulation of actions today and value in the future is worth waiting to get it. So wanted to talk about a few aspects of that question, the thinning economics. You're really trying to maximize your revenues if you can. I mean, we talk a lot about growing timber volume, but what you sell and what you bring a check to the bank. You sell your timber and you make money. And uh, and so it's great if you grew a really voluminous forest, but you should consider how that volume translates into price, costs, and ultimately into income. Um, Income is going to be equal to the volume times the price you got minus the cost it took to produce that. And I'm sure that's pretty clear, but it's interesting to think about that because thinning has real trade-offs between volume production and value production. You can create a really dense stand of very small diameter trees and get a lot of volume, but you're not going to get a lot of value, not a very low price per tree. And so there's a trade-off there. You might then thin in a way that would stimulate diameter growth, have less total volume on the stand, but you might get a lot better price per board foot for your tree. And so in this decision making, we should consider kind of the preferred species and their various prices. Here you can see on the right the difference between Western hemlock and a Douglas fir log in Western Washington for the last 2 years. And generally, larger diameter trees are going to yield you a better price. You're going to get more higher grades. You're going to get more volume scaled, but up to a limit, which we can discuss. After about 32 inches diameter, it's still very valuable, but there aren't a lot of extra value to growing past 32 inches in the current log markets. And then wood quality. If you grow really tight trees, they can grow really straight and have low taper. And if you've ever had like a tree grown in your front yard, an open grown tree, with all of its branches down to the ground, it's very conical and has very what we call a lot of taper, and actually will not produce a lot of value if you were to send that to the mill. Mills are looking for really straight trees with low taper. And they also want trees that don't have a lot of knots. So an open grown tree that had lots of sunlight and no competition its whole life really doesn't produce great value at the mill. And so when we're managing our forest, we're really trying to also manage that sweet spot between enough density that we produce high quality wood, but not too much density that we reduce costs. I mean, reduce growth. So there's like a hard to know trade-off. And the reason it's hard to know is that future markets are just uncertain. And we're gambling today on a decision in which we're not going to get paid. And maybe we thin today, hoping to make a premium on #2 Douglas fir logs in 30 years. And we're just not sure if that premium is going to be there. Right. And there's only so much you can do to handle that. It's unfortunately an aspect of forestry that I love, the multi-generational aspect that I'll hand these trees off to someone else and they handed them to me. But we can't always know what the future will hold and make the perfect decision. And so in this way, we often counsel just making an even assortment of small and large diameter wood just to protect yourself from those different price swings. But if you really think you know what the future holds, then you could target a certain diameter of tree, a certain size of tree that you think is going to produce the most value for you as you continue to thin those trees into the future. Um, so maximizing revenues, managing costs. I mean, as part of this is very straightforward. There's various costs in operating, and those reduce your profits. But the costs I want to draw our attention to are the difference between fixed costs and variable costs. A fixed cost is the same amount no matter how much volume, how much you thin, how many acres, how many trees you cut. You have to always pay the same amount to open a road, to permit the sale, and for the logger to move his or her equipment into the site. And then there's variable costs, which change based on how much volume you're selling. Felling and yarding are going to scale with the board feet you're selling, hauling also. And the difference here is that variable costs really have very little effect on your decision making because they change with the amount of volume you're selling. But fixed costs really eat into your bottom line quickly. The more frequently you harvest, the more often you incur those fixed costs, no matter how much volume you you harvested. And so that's just really an aspect to remember when we're trying to plan out our thinnings is that one, asking ourselves, what are the fixed costs at my forest? Um, you know, it's quite possible that many people on this call might have very low fixed costs. If you maintain your road network to your property for reasons other than timber harvesting, such as a cabin or recreation, then it's quite likely that actual road costs are not a major factor in your harvest decision. For other people that maybe roads decay and they have to drop a lot of money to open a road every 30 years to, or every 20 years to do a thinning, they're going to incur those costs. So, and once again, the future costs are uncertain. We don't know exactly what loggers are going to cost in the future. We don't know what the cost of permitting will be. And so also just more uncertainty when we're trying to identify the best or the optimal thinning regime, it just becomes very difficult. But one takeaway here is that the more times you harvest, the more costs you incur. And so you need to consider that. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't harvest frequently, but it's just an aspect to keep in mind. And in the same theory of economics, there's this idea of time value of money. And we talked about it in the article this week, and maybe familiar to some of this audience, which is just that people have a preference, or there seems to be a rule in society that people prefer to have money now than later. And if I loan you money, I expect some interest rate to offset the fact that I didn't have access to my money during the time I loaned it to you. And then we can take it the other way and say the discount rate is how much of a discount I would accept in order to have future money today. Kind of like an inverse discount rate. You're reverse discounting a future quantity of money, and you are you're reverse interest rating it back to today. What would you accept today? And this ultimately reflects your time preference between consumption or using your money to do something today and using your money to do something in the future. And there's a lot of different interest rates or discount rates you can consider. And this is a whole topic of its own, really common topic in resource economics. There's personal rates, social rates, capital market rates. I would think that most of this audience might consider a fairly low discount rate. If you own a family forest with some intention of passing that on to your heirs, then you may not really be interested in maximizing the short-term return on that forest, which would be a profit, a capital market discount rate. And so under different discount rates, you treat the future very differently. I think this graph over here kind of shows that. as an example, if you have a 0% discount rate, the future value is exactly equal to the present value. There is no discounting. It's a straight line. But under increasing discount rates, the value of the future becomes less and less until you can see under some high discount rates in anything past 40, 60 years isn't worth very much in the present. Um, this I call the tyranny of time because I really want to grow big, large trees. And I know many of you do too, but it's hard to convince financial markets that they should because of this graph right here. And this is a big reason why we have forestry in the Northwest is the way it is today, which is not the topic of this fireside chat, but I would be happy to get into that if anyone's interested. Um, but anyway, ultimately, the effect of this is that you should choose a discount rate. Think in your head, how much, what's your trade-off between money now and money later? And based on what you pick, it affects you in these kind of two ways, which is you prefer profit earlier than later in many situations. And the value added by waiting must exceed the loss from discounting. And if you believe in the discount rate, this is a fundamental paradigm to consider. You need your trees and the trees times the price they get, the value of your trees to grow faster than the discount rate erodes those future profits. And that is how, if you were really being financially savvy, you would think about it. I don't, even in my own, I'm part of a family forest, and we certainly don't think about the discount rate. But if we were to harness all of these factors in a spreadsheet and do something very clever, we might consider picking a lower discount rate and asking ourselves how that affects our thinning decisions. And a lot of this is boiling down to this fundamental trade-off in thinning decisions, which is the intensity of thinning versus the frequency. I mentioned this at the very beginning, and I wanted to add all of the economics on before we got here again, which is to juxtapose that there's no clear answer. It really depends on your site, your growth rates, your markets, your costs. But we have these things to consider when we're trying to decide if we should remove more trees or less trees. If we remove more trees, we don't need to thin as frequently because the forest will have longer to respond and fill the growing space before mortality or growth slows down again. We get more initial revenues, but we have to wait longer for future revenues. If we're thinning less frequently, then we're going to incur less fixed costs. But if we thin really heavily, because we don't want to come back for many years, we're going to leave a lot of wasted sunlight effectively. A lot of sun, a lot of open canopy that'll take longer to fill in. The forest will always fill back in, but it could take longer, and some of those photons will not be used to produce tree growth. And if we remove less trees, many of these are the opposite. We'll thin more frequently, we'll get less initial revenue, but we'll receive a sequence of revenues sooner, which might be interesting to people to have a periodic, every 10 to 20 years have revenues occurring versus every 30 years. But you'll get more fixed costs unless your costs are really low. And since you're going to be reducing how many trees you move, you're going to capture more sunlight. And so overall, your forest actually may produce more total volume because you're going to maintain it like right on the edge of maximum productivity. So these are the trade-offs. So there's no clear answer. I couldn't tell you without a little bit of time spent in your forest and learning your objectives if you should thin more intensely or less intensely or more frequently or less intensely. But wanted to lay out this thought process for everyone to work through because it is totally valid to move your thinning regime from 10 years to 30 years, for the 10 years to 25 years, depending on how you feel about some of these answers. Let's see here. So I want to leave with a couple of quick rules about thinning to improve revenues. Like I said, unfortunately, it's hard to give easy answers on this topic because it requires a lot of information. Um, but some thinning rules of thumb that work pretty well is to improve volume production, we want to thin before the live crown ratio, which is how much foliage the tree has divided by its total height. You can see that in the diagram to the right, drops below 30 to 35%. Because the foliage is the growth machinery of that tree, we want to maintain enough foliage on that tree so that it's healthy and it can quickly continue to grow. If it goes too much below 35, 30 below, the tree actually is doesn't have enough resource to respond well, even if it is opened up to more sunlight. It'll take a while for that tree to respond because it has so little machinery of photosynthesis. So we're looking to get down to about 30, 35, but not past it. And it's okay to be higher than that, right? This is just a bottom edge. And then as trees compete and fill the space, mortality will occur among suppressed trees, especially if you have a forest that was planted or you inherited at a pretty high density. They were set up to for mortality to occur. You can't plant 400 trees per acre as seedlings and maintain that stocking into later ages. So this mortality will begin to occur in these suppressed trees, trees that have fallen below the canopy. The dominant trees are up above, soaking up all the photons. And if you're trying to kind of maximize or improve the volume production of your forest, you want to space your thinnings far enough apart, but not so far apart. You want to try to capture their imminent mortality of these suppressed trees. And we call that capturing mortality. Those trees are bound to die, but if you can capture them in a thinning and send them to the mill, then you're going to make some money off those trees as they succumb. Um, and so you want to thin enough that that mortality rate is reduced, but you want to space out your thinnings enough to try to capture that mortality each time. It's kind of a rough rule of thumb. But when we enter a forest and see it chock full of suppressed trees that are really close to death, then we think a thinning could be a really great way to reduce, grab these trees out, send them to the mill, and open up the growing space for all the remaining trees. And if you use a growth model, you can get a sense on your site class on how productive your forest is, how frequently that will be. And then an upper bound to thinning is that we don't want to open up more canopy space during a thinning than can be reoccupied by residual trees. So it's like the idea that photons will be wasted if there's a big gap in the forest canopy. But this isn't a hard rule. Sometimes you look at other factors and decide that you really do want to thin at a little higher intensity, and you're going to let some photons be wasted. But the idea would be that before you return to the site, the canopy should reoccupy the growing space. If the trees aren't able to reoccupy the growing space before your next thinning entry, then you probably thin too intensely, right? We want to always be kind of cyclically managing the forest from too much competition to happy growth, and then too much competition and then happy growth. So that's an upper bound. And then there's a couple rules about mitigating risk that we mentioned in the article. Don't remove more than 50 trees at once, and even less if they're bigger trees. And this is about maintaining wind firmness, not blowing over, and avoiding thinning shock and a few other details. And then don't let your stand grow so crowded that your trees get too tall and narrow and unstable. And that's typically for Douglas fir and other species around an 80-foot to 1-inch ratio. So 80 to 1 height to diameter ratio. And you measure the height of your tree divided by its diameter, you can see if it's approaching the 80 to 1 threshold. And if it is, then the stand is becoming unstable and it needs to be thinned sooner than later. And this occurs because I don't know if I set the context, sorry. When trees are really densely packed, they're going to put all of their growth into height growth to outcompete their neighbors at the expense of diameter growth. And when we give them more growing space, they'll make a more optimal and safe allocation of growth to diameter versus height. And so that's why we want to thin, and because they'll relax. They'll take the pedal, they'll reduce their velocity and height growth and put a little more diameter on and stabilize nicely. Um, so those are a couple of thinning rules to improve revenue and laid out some things that we talked about in the article. Ultimately, it's just a very complex topic, and I thought that we could probably answer some questions and talk through some of the questions that, how do you put this into practice sort of thing. I think that's the last slide. Yeah. So any questions there from the audience? Oh, I see we have some chats.
Yeah, it looks like so Jonathan Cook asked a question about and is wondering how the pricing that he's receiving compares to what other folks are getting for a product. So he's saying that he's doing commercial and pre-commercial thinning on a marginal dug fir site in the San Juan Islands and able to sell firewood as 12-inch logs, or sorry, 12-foot logs to a nearby firewood processor. And he thinks in cords, or the firewood processor thinks in cords, and Jonathan is saying that he thinks in board feet. And so he's going to be selling 500 board feet or about one cord based upon what he's seen online at $100 loaded into this person's trailer. And to simplify scaling, he's using the international quarter-inch rule. And so he's wondering how that pricing is comparing to other folks for that
Got
same
it.
type of product.
Is anyone selling firewood at major quantities? I
Oh, Jonathan, I think you're muted.
Okay, yeah, there I'm back on there now.
And Jonathan, is there a reason you're selling 12-foot logs? Is that the
So that happens to fit the guy's machine really well, and they're kind of easy to handle. I mean, again, this is on Waldron Island in the San Juans. It's very remote. There's no ferry service. There's no grid power. There's no
Oh yeah.
stores, so it's kind of remote. It fits his machine, and the other people who also buy, I've gotten them used to the 12-foot thing. It's kind of like semi-automatic for me. I have my scale ticket set up for a 12-foot log. Um, that's the reason I go to 12. I mean, I could go longer, but they're harder to skid. It just kind of works out that way.
No. Well, I don't have any specific advice for you, Jonathan. Not having sold much firewood, but I could look and think about this a little bit more for you after the call, unless anyone else wants to chime in. I know, yeah, I mean, firewood would be typically like a really lower value. So what could, we have to find another firewood rate, and there aren't really posted. I'm not very familiar with firewood rates, right? We're usually selling saw timber and such.
Yeah, it's been real hard to find a firewood rate. Even, you kind of drill around in Western Washington stuff, and it's all anecdotal. And like some of the timber companies, if they're absolutely desperate, will sell firewood, or they say on their website they sell firewood, but then of course they say not selling right now. So I don't know. I'm going to give this a go and see how it works, and see if he stays reasonably content with it. And at least I'm being able to get something for my thinning. It's not.
What diameter are these trees?
Oh, they're like 8 to 10, maybe up to 12 or 14 in a couple
Yeah.
of cases. It's nothing real big.
Right, but if you weren't on Waldron, we'd sell those
Oh
like
yeah,
over tens for sure.
we had Janicki doing a real nice thinning a couple years ago, and then they were barging everything off, and that was all well and good until the barging permit got shut down by the aquatics division of the DNR with pressure from the county, but that's another whole issue. So no, we were able to barge it off of there commercially and do fine on that. But I'm trying to finish thinning this stand, just feeding into the local economy, which is basically firewood sales like that. So that's how I got to where I'm at.
Gotcha. Well, let's run through a couple more questions, and I'd be happy to answer more questions later. We got a couple more in the chat, and then feel free to jump out with other questions from folks. We got one from Lee about forest thinning effect on fire risk. Is a heavier thinning a good defense against forest fires? A naughty question. Assuming we're talking about Western Washington ecosystems, then thinning in general increases your reduces your fire risk, increases your resistance to fire. But I want to always be clear when we're talking that in Western Washington, uh, if fire were to occur in coincident with a very strong wind event, no amount of thinning will probably save your forest from these very strong winds and fires. And we live in a system with long fire return intervals, so it's very natural to stock up quite a bit of fuel. Many times, small ignitions don't go very many places, but when the ignitions occur with a strong east wind, there's not a lot we can do. Still, with that caveat aside, so that no one thinks that thinning can stop these acts of God when you see these flames run so fast. Thinning does have benefits to reducing your fire risk. Larger trees are generally more fire resistant, so thinning will produce larger trees for you. And lower density trees with more spacing in their canopies will resist running crown fires a little better. But it's a little tricky because a major factor in Western Washington is avoiding the fire getting up into the crown. And so we actually want higher canopy heights. We don't want these ladder fields. We don't want low limbs. And so if you thin too heavily, you could have quite a bit of brush and regeneration, creating ladder fields for you. So there's a little bit of kind of a caveat. I guess a long way of saying what you want to do to defend against forest fires is, create what we call shaded fuel breaks in strategic locations where you think a fire is going to come at your property and you have the best chance of preventing it from spreading. Thinning is good across your property for so many reasons, but I wouldn't choose thinning as the major defense against forest fires. And happy to jump in there, Lee, if you have anything to say. And yeah, anyone else, please just let me know what you're thinking. I've been talking plenty long. I don't want to bore everyone here.
There's
We
a
got,
couple more questions. Can you see the
oh,
general chat as
Lee,
well, or
can I see what?
the general chat that folks have put a
Yeah,
couple questions in? Okay, cool.
Sam Israel is another one I see.
Yeah,
Sam, great question about loggers charge landowners in many different ways. And is there an arrangement with the logger that works best for both parties? Yeah. This is going to depend on how much timber you're selling. That's probably the biggest thing to know, to understand. We at NNRG, working with loggers and foresters, often, given the size of the sales and the kind of limited number of loggers that can implement kind of nimble thinnings, end up with the 50-50 split or 40-60 split most commonly. The fairest method is to pay the logger for their time, right? When the logger's bidding on something, they're basically trying to guess how much work it's going to be to log this forest, and they're going to at least want that much. And then they're going to maybe try to get a little extra, right? So the fairest thing would be more of a labor relation, but we don't really see that happening. And we just have our market takers frequently at the size that we're operating, small family forests, And so loggers typically are at the size where most people that I work with are operating are giving us splits. Um, that's a good way to do it. I would recommend that over stumpage or some other methods that are unlikely to be found in a thinning, because you open yourself up to the risk of inventory. A stumpage sale is where you sell all of the value of the timber to the logger, and they write you a check, but then you don't really know what came out of your forest. With a split, at least it's getting scaled at the mill by a third party, and you can feel more comfortable about that arrangement. Cool. Got another one, Josh. Good to hear from you, Josh. Are the 80-to-1 height to diameter and 30% LCR rules applicable to hardwoods as well? Yes. I do not know if the 81 is applicable to alder. There are charts. We can look it up. It might be 75-to-1. 80-to-1 is the Douglas fir ratio, as well as like ponderosa pine and many kind of strong wood species. So I don't know for alder off my head, but it is published. 30% live crown ratio, I would apply it to hardwoods as well. But with alder in particular, alder are not, in my opinion, very plastic. They have low plasticity, in that their ability to respond to a thinning can be limited. And they have pretty major age-related declines. So because their wood is so prone to rotting, that there's kind of a shelf life for alder of about 100 years. And so if you had an older alder stand and you thinned it, you just might not get a response from it. And so applying some of these rules are pretty much a little bit more predicated on there being a response to the thinning. And so more conifer, but a big leaf maple has some decent responses. And with alder as well, sometimes if they have really bad crown shapes, they just don't recover as well because they have decurrent single-stemmed or multi-stemmed structures that can be hard to change once they can grow in certain ways based on their light conditions, and then it can be too late. But broadly, I would still apply a 30% rule to alder. You would want to thin your alder before they got to 30%. So a couple of caveats there to make it complicated on us. Lee Jemerson, about the firewood. Gotcha. Yeah, good point. Maybe firewood and pulpwood share similar market categories. Pulpwood, I don't think is very high right now. Hasn't been for 2 years or so. But could be, yeah, maybe people that can't sell their pulp are selling it for firewood. Yeah, well, those are all the questions on the chat right now, but happy to chat about anything else people want to bring up. About thinning, did everyone here read the article in the newsletter? Or was this a review? Yeah.
For your own family forest, are there any, like, what kind of, would you be able to talk about some of these things in relation to what you've experienced on your forest?
Yeah, right. So I trained as an economist, and I can talk about these sort of abstract topics, but I wanted to bring this up so people are aware of it, but I think as many of you know, like really up where the rubber meets the road is just that you forgot or the operations or, my family forest, we are not economic optimizers in any way. We sometimes put off a thinning for 5 or 10 years past when we should. And we know we're losing value, but that's not our primary objective. So I recognize that for most people, there's just operational reasons. Someone got sick and you couldn't harvest that year, or log prices are down, so you're just not going to harvest, and then you kind of forget to. A lot of reasons why we don't take our own medicine, um, I would say. But one thing we didn't talk about in thinning was also your ability to time the market. As a small operator, that is a really nice attribute to time the market, produce a couple loads of logs, and get a self-loading logger or truck to take your logs off your property. My family forest has had great success in managing our cedar stands to time major swings in cedar prices, and have reaped like 4 times the revenue, and therefore need to cut 1/4 what we would have. And so that can be super valuable. Some to time your prices to immediate activities. That's one time we felt smart afterwards. Uh, but yeah. Otherwise, we just follow more like rules of thumb about thinning, which is adequate for everyone's forest. But yeah, I think I don't know, is there anything in the slides that anyone had questions about regarding the thinning rules? I think we've talked about those a little bit. Or the pesky discount rate. Another example from my forest, we're pretty blessed actually. My family forest is down in Oregon by Molalla, Oregon. We have the benefit of really low fixed costs. This is something I was keeping in mind, is that we maintain half of our road system for our own recreation. It's like where we hold family gatherings. It's my extended family. I've been working there since I was a kid. And our neighbor on the property is a logger. And so we have the great benefit of, we just open the gate and the logger comes in. And that's how we could, capitalize on a high cedar market so quickly. And so really low operating costs, which I know is like a blessing, because most people struggle, like on Waldron Island, to get economically priced services. But I really think, fixed costs should be examined for everyone's forest, because I think for any people that have multi-objective forest management, it's very likely that their fixed costs could be argued to be quite a bit lower. Like if you're maintaining those roads because you like to do bird watching, then that shouldn't affect your decision to thin quite as much as if someone who just kept the property just for timber production, then each time they thinned, they would really be looking at that steep road maintenance bill each time. Yeah, well.
Are there any more questions about, or if anybody has any specific situations that they're dealing with, or any kind of market questions that folks have? Really any questions, but it's always fun to hear about the specific stories that folks have and the things that they're dealing with on their particular properties.
Hi, I'm Lorna, and can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, we're looking at I've lived on this farm since I was 9 months old, and I'm 73. And we have part of our problem is our timber is on the steep sides of a valley, a narrow valley, and we don't, and it's on the other side of Lucas Creek. and it should have been thin before now. I could remember the time when I was quite a bit younger, my dad took a cat and went up there, and so we're looking at some sections of alder, and we're also looking at what it takes to get right away through Warehouser. And so there's a I think it's like 200 foot between us and Warehouser. And so we're kind of working on
Warehouses Road.
yeah, Warehouser Road. And
Would
so we're
you need
working
to,
on that. And see, in the old days when my dad was alive, he built one bridge at one time, and then Weyerhaeuser used it, and there was no big deal. But now it's a lot trickier. So, do you have any recommendations on how to deal with Weyerhaeuser and making deals?
do you need to cut any of their trees to access your property, or you just want to use an existing road?
Well, I think
If we use that
I
road, we
I
would.
think if you use that road, I think there's a 200 foot, and there's some young trees, so they would have to be probably replanted or something.
So you would have to go through
But
that.
yeah. But see, the problem is there's no place in the creek even though we have a half mile of the creek in our property, there's no place to build a bridge. Because what my dad did was he built the bridge on Weyerhaeuser property, and now that property has been sold to a private person, and he just has young trees, and doesn't have a bridge. So
I see. Yeah,
anyway,
that is, I don't have personal experience working with warehouses, so I can't say, but um, certainly we have negotiated and secured leases at some of our properties, but those are always for existing road use, and I think that process is fairly harmless. The act of putting in a new road to get to the road is probably going to be more of a stumbling point because that'll be taking
yeah,
some
that
of their,
200 feet.
yeah. And,
Yeah.
Weyerhaeuser is a financial giant, and if you can get a hold of someone, I'm sure there's a price they would accept. But I couldn't.
Now, and here's another possible option, and I know it might not be you know, the best, but we're talking with a local hardwood company, and what they do is they buy the timber and then log it when it's handy for them. But what that does is it takes away that. I mean, they have a relationship with Weyerhaeuser, see? So there might be something that they could do that us as private people can't. So what do you think of that kind of thing? Like for a hardwood, it would almost be a clear cut for that particular part. Um, we have probably it'd be maybe up to a third of our timber, like 20
If you
acres or
cross the
something.
creek and you kind of get to it, yeah. Well, I think it's worth exploring. Certainly,
Yeah.
a lot of this will just be about being able to get a hold of someone and make those agreements. But right-of-ways are negotiated all the time, and there's a price per foot
Okay.
usually of new road.
Yeah.
Um, and then I don't know what the rate would be to use their roads, but it could be negotiated. But yeah, I think I like your idea of using someone who's got a relationship already to do that.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe we could speak more later about your exact scenario because I'd like to see a map. I can't quite visualize where this alder is. It sounds like it's marooned across the creek. And maybe
It
there,
is.
yeah, okay.
There's 60 acres across the creek, and it's steep. And the
Yeah.
last bit we did was it was only about maybe 12 acres or so, maybe even less than that, but they had to do it with a tower, and they went through the
Oh
thing. We
wow.
we got okay money, but it cost quite a bit to be able to use
Yeah.
the right of way. And we did it with a neighbor, see, but
Yeah.
this is far away from that, and so it's anyway, it's
Well, Laura,
but
how about you give us a call? anytime this week, and we'll chat more with you about this problem. But let me just get to a couple more questions here that have come up.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I can give you more one-on-one time, and we can try to sort that out. Um, let's see here. Josh had a question about prices.
Mhm.
Yeah. Where do you go for the best sources for current prices? The DNR publishes some. That's my go-to for a quick price, the monthly DNR sales report. That's going to give you a backwards looking 1 month in arrears look at broad market trends. But that's not going to tell you what your local mill is going to pay you because those can be somewhat different depending on what markets you're in, what type of logs you're selling. And those can be harder to get. They can be requested from the mill by saying, I want to sell some timber. Send me your mill sheet. Only very few mills have a website where they put that information. So it usually has to be requested in hand. And the third source of information is paid subscriptions to forget the name of these lumber and log quarterly market reports. But I think that's all I'm aware of. And our harvest team works with the mills to get their price sheets pretty frequently. I wonder if that would be an interesting service we could provide, even as like sourcing. We have quite a few price sheets from our operations, and maybe we could collate them.
Is that something that is considered kind of like the knowledge that they have for their business, or is that something that we would be able to share readily? Like how, I guess, like how
Well,
easy is it to get that information from mills when folks ask?
if you're selling logs, they'll give it to you. And but yeah, both
Okay.
all the mills are very cagey, but you get sheets. Sometimes it's just like not much more than a Word document with a couple lines on it. But other times it's very official. And so no, I don't know if it's copyrighted or something, but we could figure that out. Um, let's see another question from Lee about the 80 to 1 rule. Yeah, great. Let's
Oh,
work.
and
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but just so everybody knows that since we are at time, I want to thank everybody for coming and for the great fireside chat and the discussion. But I'm gonna go ahead and we'll hang around afterwards for a couple minutes if anybody has any more questions and all of that. So yeah, just wanted to make sure that that's out there.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me see if I get this one last question from Lee. 80 to 1 rule. Yeah, and so you would divide 150 foot by 150 by yeah, no, it's 16 divided by 12. Yeah. Hmm.
Would you be able to say Lee's question one more time?
Lee's question was doing the 80 to 1 rule, and he said
Mhm.
there is a 150-foot tree that is 16 inches in diameter. Um, I think that has a height to diameter ratio of 112. But I believe I put the wrong information in my slides, and that's why you got that number. So you would do 16 inches divided, like turn it into feet, and so that's 1.33 feet. And then 150 divided by 1.33 will give you about 112 height to diameter ratio, um, which is pretty high. But yeah, that is how you do it. But I guess a 16-inch tree wouldn't really be 150 feet. That's probably our difference there. Um, Lee, did that answer your question? I know I kind of didn't get at your best answer. But I'll just say you take the height and you divide it by the diameter in feet. And that is the way you do it. And so usually we measure diameter in inches. So you need to take that 16 inches. Yeah, okay, great. That's the method. And yeah, great comment from Josh. Just call up the mills, and even if you're not selling logs, they'll give you the price sheet. Good to know. Well, if there's no other questions though, thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and feel free to give us a call anytime, and talk through some of your questions you have about thinning. Try to figure out how some of these decisions could influence your choice of thinning intensity and timing. So let us know if you're ever interested.